What's up, everybody, and welcome to Why Am I Like This in the month of June, in the year of, quote, our Lord, unquote, 2024, on the day of Venus, which is in this month of June, the 7th day of the month. Welcome to the container. This container is presented on the Broom Radio as a production of the Broom. If you would like to join us live for these containers, then you can, when the street cleaning truck goes by, then you can hear me talk about joining the pot, which you can access via buymeacoffee.com/thebroomradio/membership. And then you'll have access to our Discord server where we are holding these live sessions and many other live sessions involving healing sounds. Also, a daily call to prayer, which I call tea, and sessions like field tuning and archetypal hour. Why Am I Like This is a container where I hold space for offerings to the container in the form of questions from members of the pot. And in making these containers, I also guarantee that context will be disenmeshed or karma will be released, that context will not be enmeshed, so that karma is not accumulated, and that I will hold space for good faith refinement relating to the guarantee or the container in general. And today I am receiving an offering of a question from a member of the pot and the tender and gardener of the broom named Lexi. And the question says, from your perspective, what happens / lies after death? For example, the body / the soul / the spirit. And then there's some context which is not for the recording, which I'm just going to read in my throat. And I would like to hold space for any offerings from other members of the pot about what comes up around the topic of death. And I would like to say, may her memory be a blessing. Can I share what you said about ancestral clearing, Lexi? Lexi said, today I was doing some ancestral clearing around worshipping death for myself. And I'm kind of curious if you want to expand upon that or what you mean by worshipping death. I'm just going to make this container with my hands. Tiram suk alet anmef aritarum saftelen sharet ala sakuram niel. When I say making a container with my hands, I also mean I'm making sounds with my body, because there are spirals going through my hands and my fingers, and as I move those spirals in space and time in this realm, then that makes vibrations, and those vibrations create containers of space and time. And then as I make sounds with my throat, I'm seeding that container with vibrations that will act as genetic material within that container of space and time. And so the intelligence of that container of space and time will process the significations of the sounds I'm making to produce wisdom. And this is an example of what I call terma, or what many people call terma, to be honest. And if you would like to meditate on the container that I'm making, you may, and also offer what comes up as you meditate on that container. Somebody who would otherwise be here is probably not able to hear me, but I'll say, give my regards to Larry Bird. I'll say it in text as well. Okay. So yeah, Lexi, if you'd like to share more about what you mean by worshipping death. Okay. Lexi says, being paranoid or shielding, fantasizing about bad things happening to me. Woo. And also religious programming around fear about death or life after death. I also thought of death cults, but I think that's still developing for me in my understanding and how it's connected. Ahmed Ali offered to the container that he is curious to hear about the 40th day mark post-death. And I feel like I need to process that one a little bit because it's not something that comes from my lineage. So I'm just sort of like seeing what's available in your field with regard to that, I'll say like proclamation. So the base question is like, what lies after death from my perspective, or what happens after death? I feel like I can start by talking about the Book of Coming Forth by Day, which some people know as the Egyptian Book of the Dead. And I also want to name check the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which relates to the Bardo. And yeah, I think that's a pretty good place to start. I'm just dismembering parts of myself. I know that I've talked about some of these things before, and I'd say those parts of myself don't really like to repeat themselves because it feels like a misusage of space and time, in the sense that there's like data redundancy, and also in the sense that sometimes that data is copied erroneously, and so the discrepancies between that copying can lead to error in interpretation. So what lies ahead, I'll say, of the spirit after death is different to what lies ahead for the body, I would say, after death. And then also what lies ahead for the soul. And the question specified all three. And I think it's probably easiest to talk about first the relationship between the soul and the spirit and the body. And I'll say that for me, the spirit is probably best thought of as... Sorry, this truck is coming by again, I think. Or at least it's coming by close enough to make a lot of noise. No, it's just a regular car in concert with an aeroplane. I'm under the flight path in this city, so that's why there's so much noise. I've been meditating recently upon the effects of environmental noise pollution. On especially like animals. Is the backdrop noise from the trucks and planes photo, or is it from something else? Oh yeah. Anyway, so I was talking about the relationship between the spirit and the body, and I would say bodies have intelligence at every level, down to the cellular level. I think is probably like the most discernible level at which intelligence can be discerned. Um, in the sense that like they move and that they communicate internally in order to move. I would say like those movements are downstream of what could be called electrical stimuli, and that stimuli constitutes a form of intelligence, which is to say that external stimuli are received and processed and transformed into some form of motion. And in concert, the movement and the processing and the receiving of external stimuli by the cellular material constitutes the spirit of a body. And then I would say that the sound of all of this spiritual activity creates shape cymatically. And those shapes are sort of like the bedrock for a soul. Does anybody have any thoughts about what I'm sharing right now? And so I would say that when we talk about death, we're talking about the demise of the body. And I feel like this is also something that happens separately on many different levels within the body. And I feel like talking about what happens on a cellular level when it comes to the death of the body of a cell is an adequate lens for talking about what happens on the spiritual level, and I'm going to say the solar level for what happens when what we tend to think of as a body dies. And when I say what we tend to think of as a body, I'm talking about the body of, say, me, Nobu the Younger. And I feel like the separation between like the body of Nobu the Younger and let's say like the body of Tiamat Gaia is somewhat arbitrary. In a past transmission, which I call Building Fire, I talked about the ways in which any body intakes genetic material from its external circumstances in order to recapitulate the production of its own genetic material, and the way in which that process creates ancestral traces, which I would say cross the boundaries of what we tend to think of as the body. Another plane is sort of like vibrating my brain material in a way which is not conducive to keeping the channel. But I feel like most people get what I mean when I say what we mean when we're talking about a body, right? Please disagree. But there is like Nobu the Younger's body, and Nobu the Younger's body is making sounds, and those sounds are being picked up by a microphone in my phone, and then my phone is turning those signals into bits, and those bits are being sent to a server, and then other people who are connected to that server are receiving those bits on their phones, and their phones are turning those bits into sound waves, and then those sound waves are stimulating their bodies, which are separate bodies, to Nobunayanka's body. And I would say that when each of those bodies is functioning normally, in every second, there are sub-bodies or cells in those bodies which are dying. And this process is generally referred to, in my experiences, autophagy or autophagy, which is to say that the bodies of our cells end up, much like spent batteries, needing to be recycled, so that the life force that animates those cells can be routed to new cellular material, which still has, I would say, genetic material to be transcribed and transliterated into behavior, or what I would call like the information that ends up being, I'm just going to say like printed onto ATP or adenosine triphosphate, which is sort of like the medium which cells use to communicate one another and make what I'll call promises. And I would say that when each of those cells is autophagized, then the soul of the cell can be contributed back to the solar complex of the body in which that cell has been produced, so that the solar complex of that body can retain the experience of the spirit, which is, in some ways, you could call it the book of life for that cell. And to ground this in like a relatable human experience, I would say that, first of all, like when I refer to the solar complex of the cell, I would say first that like the solar complex of the body, the spirit of that body is something that arises within the solar complex of that body, which is to say that all of the cells and their souls form a solar complex, and all of the activity and the experience of those cells, which is printed in the spirit or the ATP, which is transacted within those cells, is the arising of the spirit of that solar complex. Or you could call it, by a fairly broad definition, the selfhood of that solar complex. In the same way that you could say that whatever is on the screen of your phone in any moment is the spirit of the solar complex of the phone, which it constitutes the pixels of its screen. And then I'll say that the book of life relates to all of the experiences of one of the pixels on that screen. And then I would say that, again, to relate it to human experience, if the book of life of a cell which is being autophagized is not contributed to the solar complex of that body, then the cell that takes its place within the array of that solar complex will have to learn how to be that part of the body from scratch. Which is to say that it cannot just take the experience of the body it's replacing, or the cell that it's replacing, and mimic that experience in a way that's responsive to changing external stimuli, but has to learn from external stimuli as if it's a blank slate. And I pray that the advantages of being able to mimic previous experience and adapt it to changes in external stimuli is somewhat obvious. But please disagree if it's not. And then I'm feeling called to, again, like make this experience more relatable by talking about what this process looks like on the level of what we tend to call bodies, or what we tend to talk about when we talk about bodies. Which is, I think, going back to like the version of death which was being spoken of at the beginning of the container, what Lexi was talking about when she asked this question. So, as a refresher for my own vessel, I'll say that worshipping death constitutes being afraid of what happens after the body dies, and also fantasizing about events that may cause the body to die. And I would say that, like, from my perspective, or like what I'm sensing, this constitutes like what many people will call as a death urge or a demi-urge, or a desire to not be aware. But again, please disagree, because I feel like I'm making a jump there. Which is to say that I feel like I'm reading your field. And Lexi says that line's for me, so I might have to go put that in my predictions ledger. But in the context of contributing experience back to the vaster body, I would say that that loss of awareness could be described as a disconnection. And I'll furnish that statement with the justification that when we are aware, I would say that we are, again, as I was saying, that we do on a cellular level, we are actively receiving external stimuli, and then we're processing and then transforming that into movement. And that movement relates to, I would say, again, printing our genetic material on ATP, or I would say at the level of bodies that we tend to think of when we say the word bodies. I would say that we are printing the output of that genetic material onto what people tend to call the ether, which is also what I talked about earlier when I said that I was moving my hands and therefore moving spirals that created vibrations, otherwise known as marks in the ether. And so you could say, in a way of translating what I'm saying, that like if we are responding to external stimuli and we're moving, then we are contributing our awareness back to the vaster body that we're parts of. And hence, we are connected. And that an urge to die, I would say, is like a transfiguration of the desire to disconnect, which is to say, cut ourselves off from external stimuli, or cut ourselves off from, I'll say, like the responsibility of contributing our awareness or our processing of that stimuli back to the vaster body. And I'm going to say that that's impossible. But I will say that we can process the external stimuli and transform it into different forms of awareness, and then downstream of that, different forms of movement, which lead to more crystalline transmissions of, I'll say, like our soul and its awareness. And we can do it in less crystalline ways. And I'm going to detail what those ways look like in a moment after I pause to hold space and see if anything's coming up in the text chat. I see agreement on responsibility. I see alignment. Does anybody have any questions about what I've said so far? Looks like no. So I guess like the first, I'll say, drop off when it comes to transmitting the responsiveness of the spirit of our body to movement or marks in the ether is in disconnection between the soul and the spirit. So I would say that when the soul is disconnected from the spirit, this is usually because somebody's awareness in the lower chakras or the lower C or lower dantian is not connected to the heart fire. Which you could almost kind of like imagine as like not having access to the soul and its karma and its genetic material, which is etheric. So if you didn't have your Discord password, you wouldn't be able to log on and hear what I'm saying. And if your lower chakra energies were not sort of reconciled with the energies of the heart fire, then the spirit that I talked about, which animates the cells of the body, would not be conversant in the language of the heart. And there would not be communication between the heart and the spirit of the body, which some lineages refer to as, like, I believe, Nuff, or like the animal spirit of the body. And therefore the animal spirit would not be guided or informed by the heart fire. And then the heart fire in turn would not be informed by the experience of the animal spirit. And I would say that, like, the reason why lower C, I'll say fire, is cultivated and brought up to the heart fire is to, you could say, like, secure the protocol of connection between the heart fire and the animal spirit, so that the heart space is a safe place for the soul to arrive and dwell and communicate with the rest of the body. And so you could also consider it an affordance of the security protocol that if somebody is moving only from the animal spirit, then they do not have, let's call it, permission to write or leave marks in the ether via movement. And so their movement does not penetrate the realms which are governed by the heart. And that's the first drop off, or like the first mode of disconnection. Or you could call it like a way of receiving external stimuli and transforming it into movement, which does not result in crystalline connection. And then the second way I feel like this crystalline connection can be broken is through the physical deterioration of the body. And this is mostly what the Egyptian Book of the Dead, or the Book of Coming Forth by Day, talks about, and also what I believe the Tibetan Book of the Dead talks about. But I'll say that the vessel that I'm speaking from now has only had terrestrial contact with the earthly material of the Book of Coming Forth by Day, and this vessel has not placed hands on a copy of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, although it has read a book called Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders, which I would say is like a fairly contemporary take on the Tibetan view of what happens after the death or the deterioration of the physical body. And how am I going to frame this? I'll say that probably most of y'all are familiar with how after, I'm going to say, a spirit, quote, leaves, unquote, a body, the hair and the nails continue to grow. Please disagree. And I'll say that the growth of that hair and of those nails is an artifact of the machinations of the cellular material of the body in the absence of the, quote, spirit. And then I'll say that when I say, quote, spirit, in that sentence, I'm talking about the absence of the soul. And I'll say that usually, if you've seen like a show which is about a hospital or about an emergency room, they'll declare a body dead when the heart stops beating. Like when somebody's, I think it's an EKG, maybe it's an ECG, but whenever their heartbeat flatlines, they'll pretty often shortly after declare the body dead. And I'll say that the reason for that and how it corresponds to how I'm defining death is that when the heartbeat is no longer present, then that is an artifact of the heart no longer having electricity moving through it, which means that it's no longer able to produce that bedrock in which the soul complex can dwell vibrationally. But after that, the hair continues to grow and the fingernails continue to grow. And I would say that the spirits of the cells which are responsible for the production of hair and fingernails continue to move for a while. And that relates to the spirit being present when the soul is no longer present. And I'll pause there to talk about what happens to the soul after that event has passed. And I'll say that I've spoken before about the ritual, which is described as like the heart being weighed against a feather of Ma'at in order to determine whether it's able to cross the river Styx. And I would say that when that happens, the soul rejoins its faster soul complex, which is usually a star. And I would say that it's usually a star in our galaxy, but I would say that those stars represent soul complexes which are in communion with the galaxy known as Ma'at, which in some ways is like the archive of the experience of the quote cells unquote that incarnate in the body of our galaxy, which I call Nut, which is to say that Ma'at contains the books of tea, which are compendiums of the books of life, of the quote cells unquote, which incarnate in the body of Nut. And when those souls are judged to be too heavy, which is to say that like there's too much karmic distortion for the experience that those souls had upstream of the spirits of the bodies that animated them. It's almost like saying there's too much noise on this record for us to enter it into the archives. And usually what happens when that soul is considered too like noisy to make it back to Ma'a or to have its experience related to Ma'a, it goes into the moon. And I would say sometimes before the physical deterioration of bodies occurs, those souls are taken to the planetary consciousnesses of planets like Pluto or Saturn, or sometimes they're entered back into the sun, so that distortion can be, I'll say, scrubbed clean, and so they can make it back to Earth, so that they can have experience which may be related to the soul complex from which those souls came. But otherwise, those souls basically like end up giving their experience to lunar consciousness. And then I would say that that lunar consciousness ends up printing its experience on the bodies of currently incarnate humans, so that that karma can be washed through experience. And I'll say it usually doesn't end up being washed because the karma is too easily reified in the realm of Earth in current time. But I feel like this also relates to what I've said in the past as about the moon being a lunar repository for unhealed ancestral karma. And then to go back to the spirits of the bodies which physically deteriorate, again, like they're still active after the soul complex has vacated the body. And I feel like I'm kind of feeling tickled by what Ahmed asked about the 40-day mark after death. And I'm trying to weave something rather complex relating to the healing of, quote, ancestral spirits, unquote. And what people tend to refer to as mourning or sitting Shiva. I'll say for now that both Tibetan Book of the Dead, based on like my senses, and the Egyptian Book of Coming Forth by Day speak of mourning rituals or like rituals relating to the treatment of the physical vessel. And I would say like the hazards which relate to being in the proximity of the physical vessel as it's deteriorating. And I'll say that most of these rituals are sort of like, I'll say like, I'll say that these rituals are mostly serve the function of creating containers that protect the people who are either witnessing the rituals or taking part in them. Because both according to the Tibetan Book of the Dead and the Egyptian Book of Coming Forth by Day, the spirits of these bodies, because they're disconnected from the heart, you could say are like looking for passage to Ma'at via other people's heart energy. So in the book called Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders, he talks about how these spirits hang out at the graveyard, sort of waiting for people who are like alive to come by so that they can like hitch a ride upon that person's incarnation. And I would say that if they hitch a ride upon that person's incarnation, then they tend to influence the experience of the person that they hitch a ride upon, such that their karma can be processed by the person who is still alive. And then I'll say again that usually instead the karma is reified. And I think that it's probably worth saying that the way that a ride is hitched relates to what people tend to call courting or attachment, and is usually observable in the vessel which is still alive by having their thoughts, I'll say, consumed or occupied by the spirit that is hitching a ride. And that's not to say that one can't think about people who have passed on without being attached, but I'll say that usually when someone is thinking about somebody who has passed on compulsively, then that's a sign that what some people might call, quote, haunting, unquote, is occurring, or, quote, possession, unquote, or ride sharing, you could call it. And these spirits, I would say, are just trying to get back home. But I would say that when they hitch a ride on a physical vessel, they often make it harder for the spirit of that physical vessel to work on its own karma and prepare for its own physical deterioration. And then, like I said, they also tend to reproduce the karma that stops their soul from making it back to Ma'at. I'm just kind of like skipping over things which I could be more precise about, but they feel like things I don't need to be precise about in order for people to get what they need to get from this container. And then I'll say, going back to what Ahmed offered about the 40-day mark, that is pretty imprecise. I would say that, like, I'd say, first of all, if, like, anybody is possessed by the spirits which have not made it back to Ma'at via their soul complexes, then transmission can occur anytime. Because at that point, those spirits have sort of like jumped the barrier from the physical bodies that they were a part of, which deteriorated. And now they're like spreading, perhaps virally, through the bodies which have, let's say, quote, caught the virus, unquote, from the physically deteriorating bodies. And that those bodies can reproduce that, I'll say, karmic distortion of those spirits and transmit them to other still living bodies. And so that can happen well after 40 days has passed since the physical deterioration of the body of the one who's passed on. I would also say that that body has not really passed on, or like the spirit of that body or the experience of that body has not passed on, while the karmic distortion continues to, I'll say, like, quote, destroy, unquote, the transmission of the book of life, that spirit, to the soul complex or the book of tea. And I guess I'm tuning back into the container, and I feel like the only thing that I need to finish talking about in order to complete, from my perspective, a response to this question is what it means for a body to deteriorate and become part of the body of our planet again, which, from my perspective, happens no matter what happens to the spirit or the soul. And I guess, like, what comes up for me to say is that the burial rituals of many lineages prevent this from happening. And I'd say, like, a lineage called embalming comes up pretty strongly, in the sense that it kind of like holds the genetic material of the body apart from many processes of, I'll say, the earth body, which would otherwise decompose that body's material so that it becomes useful, or you could say in communication with the rest of the body of the earth. And I would say that one example of like a very simple ritual which ensures that, I'll say, the information of that body returns to earth, relates to, I think it's the traditions of the Parsis. I'm just going to make sure of this. But from my understanding, traditionally the bodies, eat the bodies of humans which are left on dharmas, or so-called towers of silence. And then the bodies of the vultures process the genetic material of those bodies, and then they pollinate the earth body by pooping in many places. And in that sense, like, the intelligence or the experience of those bodies can be returned to earth. I would say also that burning bodies is fairly clean. I'd say that burying bodies without, I'll say, chemical obstructions is fairly clean, but tends to take quite a long time unless it happens in certain soil structures, or let's call them like fogs. And I feel like those examples feels like it covers like what feels like clean transmission to me when it comes to like returning the body to the earth that it came from. And I'm just going to like scry the container to see if there's anything that can still be released karmically. I'm just going to make some offerings to like various heart spaces. And I feel like what comes up for me to say is that even if your soul is not light enough to transmit its book of life back to its book of tea, when the physical body deteriorates, what it has experienced ends up usually in lunar consciousness, so that it can be karmically cleaned and transmitted to its book of tea through other physical vessels. And that includes the process of what people call a reincarnation in a new physical vessel, which will end up with a new soul complex, which will have its own connection to Ma'at. And then I'll also say that cultivating awareness in one's body is the best way to abbreviate the amount of time that any soul has to spend in communion with Earth. You could say it's the fastest way of transmitting experience from the Book of Life, the Book of Tea. And I'll say that prematurely ending one's life or disconnecting one's awareness from one's soul complex tends to create more karma, which tends to create a longer, quote, sentence, unquote, in the, quote, prison, unquote, of this realm. And I would not recommend it if one desires to be, quote, done, unquote, or, quote, perfected, unquote. And with that, I'm going to close the container and I'll say thank you for offering a space and time to this container. I'd love to see you in the broom if you have any disagreements or offerings of repair or any reflections that you feel might enrich in the container. And again, you can figure out how to join us and share those reflections by going to the link in the description of this episode at buymeacoffee.com/thebroomradio/membership. I'll say that if you would like to support me in the offering of this transmission and other transmissions, then you can see the link that points to buymeacoffee.com/nobuhajime-chan. Is there anything else that I need to say at the end of these episodes so that people can connect? I mean, you can also leave comments on the YouTube video. But yeah, I think that supporting either the Broom Radio and or me would be a much more direct way to sustain this container and to contribute value back to the vessels that I would say like require quite a lot of upkeep in this realm in order to keep transmitting these things. And I pray that what I'm transmitting helps people to communicate better with one another in this plane of existence, but also to communicate more effectively between planes of existence. Which is to say, I pray that what I'm transmitting helps people to stay in their bodies and preserve that communication from the spirit of the body to the body. And I pray that it helps those spirits to cultivate themselves so that they're in communication with their souls. And I pray that all of this is karmically enlightening so that the experiences that we have on Earth can be most usefully applied to Ma'at, and so that we can have more novel experiences which are created from more novel karma instead of merely having repeat experiences which come from continuing to repeat karmic cycles. And with that, I'll close the container and I'll say goodbye to Craig if I can. And thank you for listening. Peace.